Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and remember, Context is Everything Media Network founder and CEO John Michael is reading a textbook. Please, founder, CEO, CFO, social media manager asks, subscribe, like. Thank you. Today, Chapter 26, Section 4. Yesterday, talked about Australia, talked about Canada, talked about New Zealand, and all the things that happened to them in the mid to late 1800s to early 1900s. The major events, the genocides. Simple. Today, well, that's what it was. If you're going to tell me that that's an inappropriate thing to say, you can listen to the episode and you can tell me if I'm wrong. Did genocide not occur in all of those places in that time frame? Listen, please. Like, subscribe. Thank you. Chapter 26, Section 4, Economic Imperialism in Latin America today. We're building up, setting a global context for World War I. So we're just kind of getting everybody situated in the global landscape before 1914, which is what this chapter is doing. And this is the last section of this chapter, I believe. No, it's not. Never mind. Section 4. Economic Imperialism, Latin America. Thank you. Setting the scene. The new technology of the Industrial Revolution allowed European nations to import goods from around the world. Meat, which spoiled easily and traditionally required drying before being transported, could now be shipped across the globe refrigerated vessels. One observer noted, Great Britain supplies Brazil with its steam and sailing ships, and paves and repairs streets, lights and cities with gas, and carries its mail. These and other developments contributed to intertwining of nations that might be thousands of miles apart. During the age of imperialism, Latin American nations found their economies increasingly dependent on those of more developed countries. Britain, and later the United States, invested heavily in Latin America. Lingering political problems. Simón Bolívar had hoped to create strong ties among nations of Latin America. After all, most people shared a common language, religion, and cultural heritage, but feuds among leaders, geographic barriers, and local nationalism shattered that dream of unity. In the end, 20 separate nations emerged. These new nations wrote constitutions modeled on that of the United States. They set up republics with elected legislatures. During the 1800s, however, most Latin American nations were plagued by revolts, civil war, and dictatorships. Colonial legacy. Many problems had their origins in colonial rule. As independence barely changed the existing social and political hierarchy, Creoles simply replaced peninsularies as the ruling class. What are Creoles? What are peninsularies? I don't remember, but I did read about it a couple of 100 pages ago. Kind of surprised that they don't tell me what that is in a reminder to the reader. Kind of bizarre, but whatever. I kind of know what it is, but I'm not going to get. Creoles, is that Latin American, European mix? Peninsularies? I don't remember. Colonial legacy. For most people, mestizos, mulattoes, blacks, and Indians, life did not improve after independence. The new constitutions of the 20 nations in Latin America guaranteed equality before the law, but deep-rooted inequalities remained. Voting rights were limited, racial prejudice was widespread, and land remained in the hands of the few. Owners of haciendas ruled their great estates and the peasants who worked them, like medieval European lords and fiefdoms. Instability, new subheading. Instability, with few roads and no tradition of unity, the new nations were weakened by regionalism, loyalty to local area. Local strongmen called caudillos, assembled private armies to resist the central government. At times, popular caudillos gained national power. They looted the treasury, ignored the constitution, and ruled as dictators. Power struggles led to frequent revolts that changed little except the name of the leader. In the long run, power remained in the hands of the privileged few who had no desire to share it. As in Europe, the ruling elite in Latin America were divided between conservatives and liberals. I feel like that's an oversimplification to deceive the youth of 2001 when this book was written. Published 2002, fine. Copyright 2001, that means the words were in stone in 2001. Am I wrong? In the comments below, tell me if I'm wrong. Copyright 2001. I feel like this conservative-liberal dichotomy that we keep pushing is just a way to drive people apart. Okay, let's see. If I'm wrong, please argue with me. I would love to argue. Engage in conversation. Fine. As in Europe, the ruling elite in Latin America were divided between conservatives and liberals. Conservatives defended the old social order, favored press censorship, and strongly supported the Catholic Church. Liberals backed laissez-faire economies, religious toleration, greater access to education, and freedom of the press. Liberals saw themselves as enlightened supporters of progress, but often showed little concern for the needs of the majority of the people. The interesting thing is the changing terms. Liberals no longer support the freedom of the press in the terms that this dichotomy is. Obviously, liberals are supporting the idea of liberty, but as we pigeonhole and define further, and for lack of a better term, if you know what this word means, then you'll understand what I mean. If you don't, you'll probably think, he's saying a silly word. Perversion of the word liberal. Now liberals don't respect the freedom of the press. How bizarre. It's all over the place. You can see it anywhere. And I will give you more information on it if you like, but you have to ask. Thank you. The economics of dependence. New heading. Under colonial rule, mercantilist policies made Latin America economy dependent on Spain and Portugal. Colonies sent raw materials such as sugar, cotton, and precious metals to the parent country and had to buy manufacturing goods from them. Strict laws kept colonists from trading with other countries or building local industries that might compete with the parent country. After independence, this pattern changed very little. The new republics did adopt free trade, welcoming all comers. Britain and the United States rushed into new markets, replacing Spain as the chief trading partners with Latin American nations, but the region remained as economically dependent as before. Economic dependence occurs when less developed nations export raw materials and commodities to industrial nations and import manufacturing goods, capital, and technological know-how. The relationship is unequal because the more developed and wealthier nation can control prices and terms of trade. Foreign influence. In the 1800s, foreign goods flooded into Latin America, creating large profits for foreigners and for a handful of local business people. Foreign investment, which could yield enormous profits, was often accompanied by interference. Investors from Britain, the United States, and other nations might preserve their own governments to take control if political events or reform movements in the Latin American country seemed to threaten their interests. Economic growth. After 1850, some Latin American economies did grow. With foreign capital, they were able to develop mining and agriculture. Chile exported copper and nitrates, and Argentina expanded livestock wheat production. Brazil exported coffee and rubber as well as sugar. Azúcar. By the early 1900s, both Venezuela and Mexico were developing important oil industries. Throughout the region, foreigners invested in modern ports and railroads and to carry goods from the interior to coastal cities. As in the United States, European immigrants poured into Latin America. The newcomers helped to promote economic activity, and small middle class emerged. Thanks to trade, investment, technology, and migration, not immigration, Latin American nations moved into a world economy. Yet, development was limited. The tiny elite at the top benefited from the economic upturn, but very little trickled down to the masses of people at the bottom. The poor earned too little to buy consumer goods. Without a strong demand, many industries failed to develop. Mexico struggles for stability. During the 1800s, each Latin American country followed its own course. In this section, we will explore the experiences of Mexico as an example of the challenges facing Latin American nations. Large landowners, army leaders, and Catholic Church dominated Mexican politics. However, bitter battles between conservatives and liberals led to revolts and the rise of dictators. Again, about the conservatives and liberals. Conservatives obviously don't mean the thing conservative means, which is to conserve and keep things stable. Most people in modern politics don't want things to be stable, as you can tell by the exportation of resources rather than the retention of resources within our nation, right? If we were to retain our resources in our nation, we could find a level of stability rather than depending on other nations for resources and also fighting wars for them, wherein we destabilize ourselves, which is why our nation is not completely in shambles, but there is a lot of homeless people living on the streets if you've been to any city anywhere in the country recently. Also, liberals, about the not allowing freedom of the press, I have an example for you that you can research today, which is July 6th, 2023. There's a guy running for president who's a Kennedy, and the guy who's running for president who's a Kennedy gets his stuff pulled off of YouTube regularly. That's not freedom of the press, right? He's not even saying anything that's hate speech. He's just saying things that they don't agree with, which he may be wrong about, he may be right about, but freedom of the press would allow him to speak about it. Wouldn't take his stuff off of YouTube. But hey, what do I know? Literally, I don't know anything. Well. Okay. Deep social division separated wealthy Creoles from mestizos and Indians who lived in desperate poverty. Santa Anna and war. Between 1833 and 1855, an ambitious and cunning caudillo, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, gained and lost power many times. At first, he posed as a liberal reformer. Soon, however, he revised his stand and crushed efforts at reform. In Mexico's northern territory of Texas, discontent grew. Settlers from the United States and other countries began independence movement. In 1835, American settlers and some Mexicans in Texas revolted. The next year, they set up an independent republic. In 1845, the United States annexed Texas. Mexicans saw this act as a declaration of war. In fighting that followed, the United States invaded the defeated Mexico. invaded and defeated Mexico. In the treaty ending the war, Mexico lost almost half of its territory. This defeat shook the Creoles' ruling class and triggered a new violence between conservatives and liberals. La Reforma. I know, we're talking about liberals and conservatives in Latin America. I know, but I'm just talking about the term, because they use the term referring to the European liberal and conservative. I'm using the term referring to the modern American liberal and conservative. Sue me! And triggered new violence between conservatives and liberals. La Reforma. In 1855, Benito Juarez and other liberals seized power and opened an era of reform known as La Reforma. Juarez and Zapotec Indian offered hope to the oppressed people of Mexico. He and his followers, reformers, revised the Mexican Constitution to strip the military of power and end the special privileges of the church. They ordered the church to sell unused lands and to peasants. Although conservatives resisted La Reforma and unleashed the Civil War, Juarez was elected president in 1861. He used his new office to expand reforms. His opponents turned to Europe for help. In 1863, Napoleon III of France sent troops to Mexico and set up Austrian Archduke Maximilian as emperor. For 4 years, Juarez led Mexico in battle against conservatives and French forces. When France withdrew its troops, Maximilian was captured and shot. In 1867, Juarez returned to power. Although he tried to renew reform, opponents resisted. Juarez, who died in office in 1872, never achieved all of the reforms he envisioned. He did, however, help unite Mexico, bring mestizos into political life, and separate church and state. Growth and opposition. Growth and oppression. After Juarez died, General Porfirio Diaz, a hero of the war against the French, gained power. From 1876 to 1880 and 1884 to 1911, he ruled as a dictator. In the name of order and progress, he strengthened the army, local police, and central government. Any opposition was brutally crushed. Under the harsh rule, Mexico made impressive economic advances. It built railroads, increased foreign trade, developed some industry, and expanded mining. Growth, however, had a high cost. Capital for development came from foreign investors, to whom Diaz granted special rights. He also let wealthy landowners buy up Indian lands. The rich prospered, but most Mexicans remained poor. Many Indians and mestizos fell into peonage to their employers. In the peonage system, hacienda owners would give workers advances on their wages and require them to stay on the hacienda until they had paid back what they owed. I believe a hacienda is like fiefdom in Europe, where there's like a manor in the middle where the rich person who owns it lives, and then there's like farming land where all of the people live on it and are basically working for the right to live there. In the early 1900s, many children died in infancy. Others worked 12-hour days and never learned to read or write. In the early 1900s, pressure mounted for real change. Middle-class Mexicans demanded democracy. Urban and rural workers joined protests and strikes. In 1910, Mexico plunged into revolution. It was the first true revolution in Latin America. Influence of the United States. As nations like Mexico tried to build stable governments, a neighboring republic, the United States, was expanding across North America. At first, the young republics in the Western Hampshire, Hemisphere, geez Louise, in the Western Hemisphere, looked favorably on each other. Bolivar praised the United States as a model of political virtue and moral enlightenment. In time, however, Latin American nations felt threatened by the Colossus of the North, and the giant power that cast its shadow over the entire hemisphere, the Monroe Doctrine. In the 1820s, Spain plotted to recover its American colonies. Britain opposed any move that might close the door to trade with Latin America. It asked the United States to join in a settlement opposing any new colonization of the Americas. President James Monroe, however, wanted to avoid any entangling alliances. With Britain acting alone in 1823, he issued the Monroe Doctrine. The American continents, it declared, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. The ERD, E-R-E-D, oh, what am I doing? The United States lacked the military power to enforce the doctrine, but knowledge that Britain was willing to use it as its strong navy to support the doctrine, discouraged European interference. For more than a century, the Monroe Doctrine would be a key to the United States policy in the Americas. Expansion. As a result of the war with Mexico in 1848, the United States acquired thinly populated region of North Mexico, including the Colorado River Valley and California. The victory fed dreams of future expansion before the century that had ended. The United States controlled much of North America and was becoming involved in overseas conflicts. For decades, Cuban patriots had battled to free their island from Spanish rule. As they began to make headway, the United States joined their cause, declaring war on Spain in 1898. The brief Spanish-American War ended in a crushing defeat for Spain. In the peace treaty ending the war, the United States acquired Puerto Rico in the Caribbean and the Philippines and Guam in the Pacific. Cuba was granted independence in 1901. The United States forced Cubans to add the Platt Amendment to their constitution. It gave the United States naval bases in Cuba and the rights to intervene in Cuban affairs. Naval bases in Cuba? I didn't know about that. Intervention. American investments in Latin America soared in the early 1900s. Citing the need to protect those investments, in 1904, the United States issued the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Under this policy, the United States claimed international police power in the Western Hemisphere. When the Dominican Republic failed to pay its foreign debts, the United States sent in troops. It collected customs duties, paid off the debts, and remained there for years. In the next decades, the United States sent troops to Cuba, Haiti, Mexico, and Honduras, Nicaragua, and other countries in Central America and Caribbean. Like European powers in Africa and Asia, the United States intervened in the Caribbean to protect American lives and investments. Panama Canal. From the late 1800s, the United States had wanted to build a canal across Central America. A canal would let the American fleet move swiftly between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and protect its coastlines on either side of the continent. It would also greatly reduce the cost of trade between the two oceans. This is the final section of the day. Thank you for bearing with me. Please subscribe. Please like. Panama, however, belonged to Colombia, which refused to sell to the United States the land for the canal. In 1903, the United States backed a revolt by Panamanians against Colombia. The Panamanians quickly won independence and gave the United States land to build the canal. The Panama Canal opened in 1914. It was an engineering marvel that boosted trade and shipping worldwide. To people in Latin America, however, the canal was another example of Yankee imperialism. In those years, nationalist feelings of in the hemisphere was often expressed as anti-Americanism. In 1978, the United States agreed to a series of treaties that would grant the Panama control of the canal zone by the year 2000. I'm not sure if that's still the case, but either way, thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye. This is parody. Is it? I don't know. Please follow. Please subscribe. Yes. God bless.